I don't know how many of you have been able to watch some of the Olympics the last few days. I have tried to get a little bit of that in. I'm always amazed at the skill of these people, particularly the ones who come from countries that don't have snow. I mean, there's an accomplishment, you know. I do need to tell you that I did audition for figure skating this morning when I stepped out of my car at the gas station in Volga. And from the looks of my hat going that way and me going this way and my Bible going under the car, I'm probably not going to get any medals. The thing that I think about when I watch those athletes, even though standing at the top of the half pipe, I think I would say, what am I doing here? I'd wet my pants and pass out, and I'd come down in a hurry. Is what kind of sacrifices did they make to get there? How many times did they screw up? How many times did they make really, really big sacrifices? On Ash Wednesday and last Sunday, I said to you that I wanted you to be very serious and focused on making a sacrifice. And I told you a sacrifice is something that hurts. If it doesn't hurt, it's not a sacrifice. So we think about that, and in this second week of our hunger for holiness, we're hit head on with the account from Genesis about Abraham and Isaac. Now understand, this isn't a parable. This happened. So last night in Strawberry, I sat in the step and I called this little fella up. I said, Justin, get up here, sit next to me. So he came and sat down. I said, now, do you ever go hunting with your dad? So I said, what about this? What if you and your dad went hunting? His dad was watching me. I said, what if you and your dad went hunting and you said, Dad, what are we hunting for? And he said, don't worry, you'll find out. And then unlike when you go hunting with your dad, he kind of built an altar and he tied you up and laid it on it. And then he reached for a knife. And by this time, that kid's eyes were like this. I said, what would you think? And he said, I'd be terrified. Absolutely. Absolutely terrified. And so we hear that God's messenger says, hold it, hold it, hold it, hold it, don't do anything. And then he says, because you heard me, because of that, your legacy, your future, your descendants, all this is going to be rewarded because you obeyed. Because you obeyed. Wow. In today's gospel that we always have on the second Sunday of Lent, we hear about the Transfiguration. We don't really know what that means. We know what the account says, but we don't have an understanding really of what it is. I always imagine it like in the spring when there's been a bad storm, and this is late in the afternoon, and the sky is still kind of black, but the sun breaks through. You know how really bright it looks like, and everything, the colors are really vibrant, and that's how I kind of imagine this. And so Jesus and the boys were up on the mountain, and so this is a perfect time for God to give them a special instruction. But what does he say? He doesn't say go to church. He doesn't say be perfect. He said, this is my boy. Listen to him. Listen to him. God could have told him anything. All he asked him to do was listen. Now, there's a connection then between this as we look at it, because if you looked up the word, Abraham was rewarded because he obeyed. So if you do what any good self-respecting person does nowadays, when you want to find something out, you Google it. And so you Google, what is the root word of the word obey? And the root word for obey is a Latin word called audere, which means to listen. That's what it means to obey, is to listen. That's why your mom says, you ain't listening to me, when you don't do what you're supposed to be doing. You don't listen. And so that's, folks, where the sacrifice starts, is in listening, because that's hard for us. By God, nobody's going to tell us what to do. We want to be our own design in all of this. This is where the sacrifice comes, because there's a difference between what I want and going to God and say, what is your desire for me? Now, I want to ask you to raise your hand, but have you ever, in times in your life when you're facing a big decision, have you ever said, all right, God, what would you have me do? I can't figure this out on my own. If you have, good for you. But a lot of people are afraid to do that, either because they're afraid that God will ask them something that they can't do. And of course, God will never ask you to do something He won't equip you for. Or they don't want to know. They don't want to know, so they just don't ask. The thing that happened to Abraham, because he went that far to listen, to obey, is that God transformed him. He was never the same. His life was all very, very different. That's where the sacrifice happens. And that's what I think about when I look at the Olympics. You know, I think about everything that those people have sacrificed to become proficient and successful in what they did. It wasn't just a few inconveniences. They were so hungry for that medal that it focused their entire life. It's kind of like going to the state basketball tournament, isn't it? Go Vikes! Okay, but let's use a different example. We can talk about hungers and we can talk about sacrifice in all other areas of our lives. And you folks have made sacrifice. If you've raised one kid, you know what it means to make a sacrifice. But why are we so reticent when it comes to our spiritual lives about making a sacrifice? I mean, that's why I have to laugh when we talk about stuff for Lent. And somebody says, well, I'm going to give up pie. We don't get it. And one of the things I've been thinking about this week is some of you who are my age or older know that we always used to refer to, when we came to church, was we celebrate the sacrifice of the Mass. We still believe that this is a sacrifice, an unbloody representation of Christ's death on the cross. It's a sacrifice. That's the whole reason. That's why we talk about not just going to church, but being church. It's kind of like saying, okay, I'm going to go to the family reunion once a year, and you put up with that one uncle of yours, you know, who's kind of, but then you never talk to him for another year, so that's not really a big sacrifice. Being a family and being committed to the craziness of your family, that takes sacrifice. That takes sacrifice. It's not just a one-shot deal. Well, the same thing is true as church. It takes no sacrifice to go to church. It takes a lot of sacrifice to be church. And yet I, as a priest, hear people say, well, I hate to go, or I don't like the Mass schedule, or we don't have our 4 o'clock Mass anymore, or it's not on the right Sundays. And somebody called up the secretary this week from one of the parishes and chewed her out. They, of course, wouldn't identify themselves. And so people just aren't going to go anymore because they're never getting Mass at their place. I said, really? We got churches every 8 miles? You don't get this, do you? This is not about convenience. This is about sacrifice. This isn't Father John's idea. It was that guy's. He never said, you know, I know you're supposed to kill me on Good Friday, but I'm kind of busy that day. Could we push it off to next week, maybe Good Monday? Because that's not good for me. Sacrifice. We've forgotten about that. We, particularly in our country, don't have to sacrifice for our faith. There are people this morning all over the world who risk their lives to get to Mass. Honest to God, who dodge bullets to get to Mass. And it was just not quite a year ago that we were having accounts in the paper in countries where if the powers that be found out that a family baptized a baby, like this cutie here, they would get the baby and they cut the baby's head off and put the baby's head on a stake in the middle of the town square to deter parents from getting their kids baptized. That's happening now. Nobody here, including me, is making that kind of a sacrifice for their faith. Now, what's the point? The point is that sacrifice is the key to holiness. Now, a lot of us grew up with kind of a weird idea of holiness. Church never really said this, but they gave the impression that holiness was kind of being perfect. Well, we're all screwed because nobody's perfect. You're never going to be perfect, so you give that up. So we have these really weird ideas about what holiness is. You know what holiness is? It's listening. It's not about being perfect. It's not about doing a bunch of external rules and regulations. It's about having a relationship that you really hunger for what God wants in your life. That's what holiness is. That's why our theme for this year is this concept of hungering for holiness. There's a lot of good things in the world. There's a lot of good hungers in the world that aren't bad. But there needs to be a primary one. And that primary one is going to cause us to make sacrifices. If we don't, then we're not going to grow. There's people say, well, I go to church, I don't get anything out of it. Well, if all you do is go, yeah. But if you start to make a sacrifice for your faith and start to hunger for that, I promise you, Scouts honor, cub or boy, I promise you that God will honor that and will make changes in your life. God honors that. But most of the time we give him small change, and then we want change back. Sacrifice. We need to hunger for holiness because me and you make mistakes. We screw up. We're never going to be perfect. And so we need to hunger for that because God knows our hearts. If you say, man, I'm trying though, God knows that. And so this hunger is the only thing that sacrifice can satisfy. Let me repeat that. This hunger for holiness is the only thing, sacrifice is the only thing that can satisfy that. Because that will make us grow in our faith. God will honor that, God will bless that, God will nourish that. It's not my idea. It comes to us in the scriptures. And so what do I sacrifice? This is easy. Less of me, more of thee. That's what we're all called to. Less of me, more of thee. And that's always a struggle. It's a struggle for me. It's a struggle for you. But if that's the desire of our hearts, that's all God wants. Remember what the first reading said on Ash Wednesday? Return to me with your whole heart. It's all I want is your desire. I'm really trying to do a good job. Those Olympic athletes would not be successful if they didn't have the desire, if they didn't have that hunger. If you could harness half of that, a fourth of that, an eighth of that for your spiritual life, you'd be amazed. You'd be amazed. That's the hunger for holiness. Just depends on one thing: if you're willing to make the sacrifice.